"That's my wife," were the 3 words that saved Yuki's life and cost Silas Creedy everything he'd spent 20 years building. He'd come to Garrett's trading post to buy a carriage, nothing more, a wealthy rancher doing routine business in a territory where the Garrett family controlled every price and every breath of law. But when he found a Japanese woman bound and silent inside a grain bin, she didn't beg or plead or reach for him. She just watched him with eyes that had already survived worse than anything this frontier could threaten her with. He had 10 seconds to decide whether to walk away or tell a lie that would start a war. Stay until the very end to see how it unfolds, and if it moves you, hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The rain had turned the road into a river of mud by the time Silas Creedy rode through the gates of Garrett's trading post. His horse picked its way across the yard, hooves sinking with each step, throwing brown water against the horse's belly. The post itself hunkered at the far end like something that had grown out of the ground rather than been built. Log walls, silvered by weather. Shutters pulled tight against the storm. Smoke curling from a chimney that hadn't been cleaned in a year. It was part store, part saloon, part fortress, and the Garrett family had run everything within 50 miles from those walls for the better part of a decade. Everyone in the territory understood that the prices on the shelves were just the starting point for negotiations that always ended in the Garrett's favor. Silas dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, shaking the wet from his hat before pushing through the door. The warmth hit him first, then the smell of wood smoke and coffee and the sour undertone of men who'd been drinking since noon. The main room stretched long and low, a counter along the left wall, shelves behind it stacked with canned goods and ammunition and bolts of cloth. The right side held a bar and 3 rough tables, where 4 men sat over cards and bottles, their eyes tracking Silas as he walked in, but not one of them nodding a greeting. These were Garrett men, and you could tell by the way they watched everything and reacted to nothing. Deacon Garrett stood behind the counter, silver-haired and slow-moving, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he'd never needed to. He wore a clean shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, and his hands rested on the counter the way a judge's rest on a bench, patient and final. When he saw Silas, his mouth spread into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Creedy, didn't expect you back so soon." "Carriage," Silas said. "You told me last month you had one in the back storeroom." Deacon's smile widened a fraction. "I did. Still do. Come on through." He led Silas past the counter and through a doorway hung with a canvas curtain into a long back room stacked with crates and barrels, the accumulated evidence of a trading post that served as warehouse, holding pen, and treasury all at once. The air was cooler back here, thick with the smell of grain and leather and something faint and sharp like herbs Silas had never encountered on any ranch. The carriage sat against the far wall, a smart buckboard with good wheels and a harness that looked like it had been oiled yesterday. Silas crossed to it and ran his hand along the frame, checking the joints, testing the give in the suspension, the way a man evaluates a tool he's going to trust with his livelihood. Everything checked out. The leather was supple, the ironwork solid, the wheels true. He crouched to examine the axle, and that was when he noticed the grain bin. It sat beside the carriage, waist high, the lid closed but not latched. A thin line of dark ran along the edge of the lid where it met the rim, and Silas touched it without thinking, bringing his finger up to the lamplight to find blood, fresh enough to be tacky. The bin wasn't meant to hold grain. Nothing in this room was only what it appeared to be, and Silas had known that the moment he walked through the door. But knowing it and finding blood on your fingertips were 2 different things. His hand moved to the lid. The lid swings open, and the air leaves Silas's lungs in a single, hard breath. A woman lies curled inside the grain bin, bound at the wrists and ankles with rough cord that has cut deep into her skin, her knees drawn up to her chest because the bin wasn't built for a person to fit. She wears a dark indigo kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, the silk torn at the shoulder and across her left cheekbone a bruise spreads in purple and yellow, the kind of mark that comes from a fist, not a fall. Her hair is pinned in a traditional knot at the back of her neck, black and heavy, and despite everything, not a single strand has come loose. She doesn't move when the light hits her. She doesn't shrink away. She looks up at Silas with dark eyes that hold no fear, no pleading, no hope, just the steady patience of someone who has stopped waiting for anything and is simply enduring what remains. Beside her, wedged between her hip and the bin wall, sits a small lacquered medicine box, the wood polished dark red and fitted with brass hinges that have turned green with age. Box is wrong for this place, the way a cathedral would be wrong in a saloon. A piece of refined craftwork among the rough grain and splintered wood, and Silas stares at it for a full 2 seconds before he understands what he's seeing. Inside the box he can glimpse needles so fine they catch no light, just the faintest glint, like fish bones made of silver, and paper packets of herbs that give off that sharp smell he noticed when he first entered the room. Healing tools, the kind a frontier doctor would never own, because no frontier doctor had ever been trained to use them. The woman watches him take it all in, and when he finally meets her eyes again, she holds his gaze without blinking. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't surrender, but something quieter than either, the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome and finding it survivable. Silas can see the discipline in every line of her stillness, a person who has been broken before and decided that breaking was not the same as ending. Then, heavy, deliberate footsteps sound on the wooden floor behind him. Deacon Garrett's voice arrives before the man himself, calm and casual, the voice of someone who owns the room and everyone in it. Find what you were looking for. Silas straightens, but doesn't step away from the grain bin. His right hand hangs at his side, close enough to the revolver on his hip that the gesture isn't accidental. Found more than that. Deacon reaches the doorway and stops, his smile fixed, his eyes moving from Silas to the woman in the bin and back again, without a flicker of concern. She came in on a shipment from the coast a few weeks back. Owes debts, working them off. Company property, you understand. The woman doesn't move. She hasn't moved since the lid opened. Her eyes stay on Silas's face the way a person watches a door that might open or might stay locked, depending entirely on what the person on the other side decides to do. Silas has maybe 10 seconds to choose. He can walk away and ride home to his ranch and his comfortable life, and nobody will think less of him because nobody rewards a man who sticks his neck out for a stranger. He can report it to the sheriff, who drinks at Garrett's bar and wears a badge the Garretts paid for. Or he can do something that will mark him as either the bravest man in the territory or the deadest. Silas turns to face Deacon Garrett fully and speaks the 3 words that will change both their lives. That's my wife. The room goes still, the card game behind him stops, the men at the bar stop pouring drinks, and even the rain on the roof seems to quiet, as though the storm itself is waiting to see what happens next. Deacon's smile doesn't waver, but his eyes change, narrowing by a degree that Silas can feel in his chest like a knife point resting against the skin. Your wife, Deacon repeats, and the 2 words land like an examination, a man turning a coin to see if it's counterfeit. Since when does this territory require papers for a man to claim his own? Silas holds the stare, and something in his voice, maybe the steadiness of it, maybe the fact that he doesn't blink, makes Deacon pause. The pause lasts 3 seconds, long enough for both men to understand what it means. Silas is lying, and Deacon knows it, and none of that matters, because the lie is now a public fact witnessed by every man in the room. Deacon's smile returns, thinner now. Bring her back by Sunday, or I'll come get her myself. Silas lifted the woman out of the grain bin with one arm under her shoulders and the other behind her knees, and she let herself be moved without resistance, without assistance, a weight that was lighter than it should have been. He cut the cords at her wrists and ankles with his knife, and the skin beneath was raw and dark. rope burns that would scar if they weren't treated. He set her in the carriage seat, draped his coat across her shoulders, and paid Deacon Garrett for the buckboard. With cash? He counted out slowly the way you handle money when the man across from you is looking for an excuse. He drove out of the trading post at a walk, not a trot, because running would confirm what everyone already knew, and walking made the lie look like the truth. A husband collecting his wife the way a man collects anything that belongs to him. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time the trading post disappeared behind the ridge, and the road stretched ahead through gray grass and standing water, the kind of country that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know the way. Silas drove with both hands on the reins and his eyes forward. Beside him the woman sat with perfect posture, her bruised hands folded in her lap beneath his coat, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She hadn't spoken a single word since he'd found her. Not her name, not a question, not a sound. He tried English first, simple sentences, asking her name, where she came from, whether she was hurt anywhere besides the visible wounds. She turned her head slightly when he spoke, enough to show she was listening, but offered nothing back. He tried gestures next, pointing to her wrists, then to himself, raising his eyebrows in a way that was meant to ask if she wanted him to wrap them. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and shook her head once, small and deliberate, not refusal but something closer to patience, as though she was waiting for him to understand something that would take longer than a single ride home. He reached across to adjust the coat where it had slipped off her shoulder, and she flinched. It was the first movement she'd made that wasn't controlled, a single involuntary jerk of her whole body, there and gone in half a second. Silas pulled his hand back slowly, deliberately, holding it in the air where she could see it, the way you show a wounded animal that you're not reaching for a weapon. She watched his hand retreat, and then the stillness came back, but something in her eyes had shifted, a recognition that he'd seen the flinch and was choosing not to use it against her. The rest of the ride passed in silence, broken only by the horse's hooves and the rain tapping the carriage roof, and Silas spent it counting the cost of what he'd just done. He'd lied to the most dangerous man in the territory about a woman whose name he didn't know, and he'd been given until Sunday to change his mind or face the consequences. But Sunday was closer than it sounded, and somewhere behind them, a man who killed people for lying was already counting the hours until he could correct the mistake Silas had just made. The Double C Ranch materialized out of the dark as the carriage crested the last ridge, windows glowing amber against the night, the barn lit, the bunkhouse smoking, and the whole of it looking like the kind of place a man could believe was safe even when he knew better. The foreman, Tom Avery, met them at the porch steps, his face cycling through confusion and alarm as he watched a small Japanese woman step down from the carriage in a torn kimono and a borrowed coat, her wrists wrapped in bloodied strips of Silas's shirt. Tom pulled Silas aside while one of the hands showed the woman inside. "What do you do?" Silas gave him the partial truth, that she'd been held against her will at the trading post, that he'd gotten her out, that the Garretts wouldn't take it kindly. Tom's jaw worked like he was chewing on something that wouldn't break down. And now what? That was the question Silas couldn't answer, so he didn't try. He told Tom to set a watch on the Ridge Road, and went inside to find the woman standing in the middle of his kitchen, taking stock of the room the way a general surveys a battlefield. She moved her gaze across the cast-iron stove, the dry goods shelf, the medicine cabinet beside the window, the water pump, cataloging everything with a precision that Silas recognized from his own habits, the way a rancher walks, a new piece of land. The trouble started before midnight. Pete Dalton, one of the older hands, came in from the barn with a gash on his forearm, deep enough to show the white of the tendon beneath, caught on a wire fence while he was bedding down the horses in the storm. The men gathered around. Someone reached for the whiskey bottle and a needle, the frontier's answer to everything from bullet wounds to broken bones, but the woman moved before any of them could start stitching. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took Pete's arm without asking permission, and Pete jerked back like he'd been touched by a live coal, but her grip held not strong but precise fingers pressing points along his forearm that made him stop struggling and go very still. She opened the lacquered medicine box on the table, and the hands all leaned in to look at what was inside. Needles so fine they were nearly invisible, paper packets of dried herbs, a small bottle of liquid that smelled sharp and clean, unlike anything that had passed through their hands on any ranch. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with the liquid, packing the deepest part with herbs from 3 different packets, then threading a needle so thin it disappeared against the firelight, and closing the gash with a technique none of them had ever seen. When she finished, the wound looked like a line drawn in pencil rather than a ragged tear. Pete stared at his own arm like it belonged to someone else. It doesn't hurt, not like it should. The woman didn't respond to that because she wasn't done. She selected a single needle from the box and pressed it into a point above Pete's elbow, and his whole face changed from confusion to something that sat between shock and grudging respect, because whatever she'd done, the throbbing ache that had been climbing up his arm just stopped. She put the needle away, closed the box, and stepped back from the table, and every man in that kitchen watched her with an expression that Silas couldn't quite name, because it was too new for any of them to have felt it before toward someone they'd expected to fear. But the question that hung in the air after she left the room wasn't about what she'd done to Pete's arm. It was about what else those hands could do, and whether the Garretts knew it too. The rider appeared on the ridge at first light, sitting his horse against the gray sky the way a bookmark sits against a page, marking the place where the story changes. By noon there were 2 of them, Garrett men with hard faces and good horses, and they rode down to the fence line like they were visiting neighbors, easy in the saddle, no hurry, no threat in their posture, because the threat was in the message, and the message didn't need posture to carry weight. Tom Avery went out to meet them while Silas watched from the porch, and when Tom came back his face was the color of old iron. "They want the woman back by Sunday." "If she's not at the post by sundown, they're taking 100 head of cattle in payment. Their choice, which 100?" The ranch hands gathered in the yard, and the mood split down the middle like a log hit square. Half of them wanted to fight, stood there with their fists and their outrage and the frontier conviction that a wrong should be righted with whatever was closest to hand. The other half had been in the territory long enough to know what a fight with the Garretts looked like, and they stood quiet, because quiet was the only honest response to odds that bad. Silas told them all to stand down, because open war with the Garretts meant dead men on both sides, and a ranch without hens was just land with debt. That night Silas sat alone in the ranch house kitchen, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, counting what he had against what he owed. 600 acres of good grass and water, 400 head of cattle and climbing. 8 hands who'd follow him into a fair fight, and maybe half of them into an unfair one. And one lie growing heavier by the hour. A woman whose name he still didn't know, living under his roof because he'd claimed her with 3 words he couldn't take back. The doorway darkened, and the woman appeared, her bruised face half lit by the stove's ember glow, her hands folded in front of her, standing the way she'd stood in the trading post, with a stillness that made the room feel smaller. She watched him for a long moment, and then she spoke for the first time since he'd found her. A single sentence in Japanese, the syllables musical and unfamiliar and utterly without ceremony. Then, slowly, in English that was careful and accented and precise as her needles, she said, "I can pay." She told him her name was Yuki, and she explained in fragments and gestures that she had been a healer in her village outside Kyoto, trained by her grandmother for 15 years in the old medicine, the herbs and needles and ways of reading a body that her family had practiced for 4 generations. He hadn't come to the territory willingly. A man had found her in Yokohama and promised her honest work as a doctor in a place where doctors were scarce, and she'd crossed an ocean on that promise, only to arrive and discover that the man had sold her debt to the Garrett family before her ship had even docked. The debt was imaginary, the contract forged, and her skill had become her prison, because the Garretts understood that someone with the power to save a life held the equal power to withhold it, and that kind of control was not something they allowed to walk free. The lacquered medicine box sat on the table between them, her grandmother's tools, the only thing she'd been allowed to keep. Everything else, her clothes, her documents, her earnings, had been taken the day she arrived. She pressed her palm flat against the box and didn't look away from Silas, and in the silence that followed, something shifted between them that neither of them had a word for. But the silence didn't last, because Saturday was coming, and with it the reckoning that neither of them could postpone any longer. Saturday evening came down on the double C like a lid closing, and Silas stood at the ranch house window, watching the sun sink behind the ridge, counting the hours until Sunday. 12 left, maybe less if Deacon Garrett decided to make his point early. Tom Avery joined him at the window, arms crossed, his bandaged shoulders stiff under his shirt but functional, a living argument for Yuki's value that Tom didn't need to make out loud because his presence made it for him. "We can't beat the Garretts in a straight fight," Tom said. "They've got 20 guns and the sheriff on their payroll." Silas knew this. He'd known it the moment he opened his mouth at the trading post, and he'd known it every hour since, and knowing it hadn't changed a thing about what he'd done or what he was going to do next. He also knew what surrendering Yuki meant, not just for her, though that would have been enough, but for what it said about who he was, what this territory had become, and the world they were building, where a woman could be chained in a grain bin, and the only consequence was the cost of getting her out. The door opened behind them, and Yuki entered the kitchen, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor, her presence announced by the faint herb smell that always clung to her. Now she had been listening. He could see it in the way she stood, not hovering, but planted, not intruding, but present, a person who had earned the right to be in the room where her fate was being discussed. She looked at Silas and spoke in the careful English she'd been practicing all week, each word placed like a needle, exactly where it needed to go. "You should not die for a stranger." Silas looked at her for a long time, long enough for the stove to click as the fire settled, long enough for the last light to leave the window and the kitchen to settle into the amber glow of the lamp. Then he said, "You're not a stranger anymore." It wasn't love, it wasn't even trust, but it was a recognition. Two people who'd both learned what it meant to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves. Two survivors who understood that sometimes the only choice left was to gamble everything on a desperate bluff. Yuki held his gaze, and something passed between them that hadn't been there a week ago, a thin line of mutual understanding that was stronger than it looked because it was built on action rather than words. Then she told him something that changed the calculation entirely. The Garretts didn't just trade goods at that post, they traded people. She'd seen others during her weeks in captivity, not just her, and the territory knew, but looked away because the Garretts supplied what no one else would, feed and tools and medicine and credit when the droughts came, and the cost of defying them was always higher than the cost of silence. This information was a weapon. Not a gun, not a badge, not a legal warrant, but something more dangerous. A secret that could turn the territory against the Garretts if the right people heard it at the right time. And Yuki was telling Silas that the right people were closer than he thought. Sunday morning broke clear and cold, frost on the fence wire, the horse's breath clouding in the yard, and Garrett's riders waited at the property line like vultures on a branch, patient and certain that their meal would come to them. Silas rode out alone to meet them, not to surrender, but to test the ground. He made a counteroffer that Yuki would stay at the Double C, and in exchange he would pay the Garrett's price in cattle, 100 head over 6 months, with interest. Because a man pays his debts even when they aren't his. The offer was designed to buy time, but more than that, it was designed to reveal something. If the Garretts wanted Yuki back badly enough to refuse cattle, then she was worth more to them alive than the debt she supposedly owed, which meant she wasn't a debtor at all, but property they wanted to keep, and the debt was just the story they told to justify the chains. The rider carried the offer back to Deacon Garrett, and the answer came before noon, delivered by the same hard-faced man who'd brought the first warning. The answer was no deal. Come to the post with the woman, or they'd come to the ranch and take everything, and they didn't mean some of it. Silas now had proof of what he'd suspected. The Garretts didn't want cattle. They wanted Yuki. Specifically, which meant she knew something, or could do something they couldn't afford to lose. And that made her not just valuable, but dangerous. And that was a very different kind of leverage than a debt that could be paid off. He found Yuki in the kitchen sorting dried herbs into paper packets, the medicine box open beside her, the smell of ginger and something bitter filling the room. He sat down across from her and asked her directly what he should have asked days ago. What did you do at the trading post? What made you valuable enough to chain up in a grain bin? Yuki set the pestle down and met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, something like reluctance crossed her face, not because she didn't want to tell him, but because the telling meant admitting the full scope of what she'd been to the Garretts and what that meant for anyone who stood between them. She told him about Margaret Garrett, Deacon's wife, a woman who had been dying for months of a sickness no frontier doctor could name or cure, a fever that came and went and left her thinner every time. Yuki had recognized it from her training, a condition her grandmother had described in notes passed down through 4 generations of healers, and she'd begun treating it with herbs and needles and careful dietary changes, and for the first time since the sickness started, Margaret Garrett had started improving. And that was when Deacon decided Yuki was too dangerous to let walk free. A healer with the skill to save a life held the same power to let it slip, and a woman carrying that kind of leverage was not a servant. She was a threat, and threats in Deacon Garrett's territory did not walk around untethered. So he'd chained her in the grain bin, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd done something too right, and the only way to control that kind of power was to own it completely. And that meant the Garretts weren't coming for a debtor. They were coming for the only person who could keep the matriarch of their family alive, and that made the next move far more dangerous than a territory war. They came in the dark, as Silas had known they would, because men like the Garretts did not announce themselves in daylight, where witnesses could count their faces. 3 riders over the ridge, just past midnight, torches already lit, and they didn't waste time with warnings. They rode straight for the barn, and the barn went up like a prayer, answered in the worst possible way, dry timber and hay catching the flames so fast that Silas barely had time to get the horses out of the nearer stalls before the whole structure was screaming with heat. The cattle stampeded through the broken fence, bellowing into the night, and the riders took shots at the ranch house windows, not to kill but to remind, the crack of each round arriving a half-second before the punch of impact against the wall. Silas and his men took cover where they could, behind the water trough, inside the stone root cellar entrance, anywhere that would stop a bullet, and the night split into fire and noise and the terrible chaos of a place that was supposed to be safe. Tom Avery caught a bullet in the shoulder, the second wound in the same arm, and he went down behind the pump house with blood spreading across his shirt like a dark tide. One of the younger hands panicked and ran into the open yard, and a bullet winged his thigh and put him down screaming, and the sound of that scream cut through the gunfire and the fire crackle and the cattle's panic and reached Yuki inside the ranch house. She came out through the kitchen door without hesitation, moving through the chaos like someone who had already decided that fear was a response she couldn't afford, her lacquered medicine box clutched against her ribs, the way she'd held it in the grain bin, the only thing she owned in a territory that wanted to own her. She reached Tom Avery and pulled him by the collar into the kitchen doorway, out of the line of fire, and she opened the box on the floor beside him and went to work. Her hands moved steadily while bullets cracked against the walls outside, selecting needles that caught the lamplight, pressing them into points along Tom's shoulder and collarbone that made him grit his teeth, and then, seconds later, made the tension drain from his face because the pain had stopped spreading. And Tom Avery lay on his kitchen floor watching a Japanese woman save his arm for the second time in a week with tools that had no equal on the frontier. The riders pulled back before dawn, leaving the barn a shell of charcoal and the fence line broken in 3 places and a message nailed to the gate with a single iron spike. Wednesday. The woman. Or, the next visit won't stop at cattle. Tom Avery sat up from his bedroll by the cold stove, his shoulder bandaged with herbs carrying a scent none of them could name, and he told Silas the truth that he'd been chewing on all night like a man working a bone. The Garretts don't own this territory because they're strong. They own it because nobody's had a reason to stand up. You give people a reason, and 20 guns don't matter. Tom's plan wasn't about guns. It was about Yuki's skill, and the fact that word of what she'd done for Pete's arm and Tom's shoulder had already spread beyond the Double C, because ranch hands talk the way water flows, downhill and unstoppable. And by now every ranch within riding distance knew that Silas Creedy had a Japanese healer who could stop a wound from bleeding in minutes and ease pain that frontier whiskey couldn't touch. In a territory where every man depended on his body to survive, where a broken arm could mean a lost season and a fever could mean a lost life, that wasn't a curiosity or a convenience. That was survival itself. Silas rode out that afternoon not toward Garrett's post, but the opposite direction, to the neighboring ranches, and he didn't go asking for guns. He offered something the Garretts never had and never could, a healer who could save lives, available to anyone in the territory who needed her, if they'd stand with the Double C when the Garretts came calling. The first rancher, Walt Pritchard, said yes within 10 minutes. His wife had been sick for 3 months with a cough that wouldn't break, and the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away and charged more than Walt could afford. The second rancher's son had broken his arm last spring, and it had never healed right, and the boy walked with his shoulder crooked now, and the rancher had been watching it get worse for half a year. The third rancher, a widow named Harriet Cole, who ran her own spread with 6 hands and a grudge against the Garretts that went back longer than anyone could remember, didn't need a reason at all. She'd been waiting for someone to go first, and Silas had just walked through her door. By the time Silas rode home, 5 ranches had pledged their support, and the number wasn't what mattered. It was what each of those pledges represented. Families who'd been surviving under the Garrett's thumb because the alternative was worse, and now the alternative wasn't standing alone anymore. The territory was beginning to understand that the Garrett's power rested on nothing more than the assumption that nobody would challenge it, and assumptions have a way of collapsing the moment a single person proves them wrong. Wednesday morning arrived cold and still, the kind of stillness that settles before a storm or a reckoning, and Deacon Garrett rode up to the Double C fence line with 15 men behind him, expecting to find one rancher and a handful of hands who'd already seen what Garrett guns could do. Instead, he found 30 men from 5 ranches lined along the fence, armed and waiting. Not a mob and not an army, but neighbors who decided that the Garrett's time was over, and the quiet certainty on their faces was worse than anger because it couldn't be negotiated away. Deacon didn't charge. He was a businessman, not a fool, and he could read the arithmetic on that ridge as well as anyone. 15 against 30 were odds that didn't favor the attacker, and the men behind him weren't fanatics. They were hired guns who understood that dead was dead no matter who signed the paycheck. He sat his horse at the gate and looked across the yard at Silas, and the calculation going on behind his eyes was as visible as the frost on the wire. But Deacon Garrett had one card left, and he played it with the precision of a man who'd been saving it for exactly this moment. His wife was dying, and, without Yuki, Margaret Garrett had weeks at most, the fever that Yuki had been holding at bay already climbing back. He didn't shout the offer or bargain for terms, but stated it plainly, standing in his stirrups so every man on that ridge could hear. Yuki comes back to treat his wife, and the Garretts leave the Double C alone forever. No cattle, no debt, no war. A simple trade of one woman's skill for one family's survival, and on its face it was the kind of offer that frontier justice would call fair. The ridge went quiet, and Silas looked at Yuki standing in the ranch house doorway, and he understood that this was not his choice to make, it was hers, because the whole point of what he'd done was to give her a choice she'd never been allowed before, and taking it away now would make him no different from the man who'd chained her in a grain bin. The ridge waited, Deacon waited, 30 men with rifles waited, and Yuki stepped forward. Yuki stepped forward out of the doorway and into the yard, and she walked past Silas without stopping until she stood where Deacon Garrett could see her clearly. She spoke in English, slow and careful, each word placed with the same precision she brought to her needles. "I will treat your wife, but I will come and go as I please. I am not your property. I am a healer, and I decide who I heal." The frontier code met the Japanese honor code in a single sentence, and Deacon Garrett, for the first time in anyone's memory, had no comeback, because arguing would prove that his offer wasn't about his wife's health, but about control, and everyone on that ridge already knew it. He looked at Yuki for a long time, and then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and his 15 men followed, and the ridge held its breath until the last rider disappeared over the far hill. Yuki rode to the Garrett ranch that afternoon with Silas beside her, and she treated Margaret Garrett with the same focused precision she'd shown Tom Avery and Pete Dalton, her grandmother's needles and carefully chosen herbs moving with the confidence of 15 years of training, and it took 3 visits over 2 weeks before the fever broke. And when it did, Margaret Garrett opened her eyes and looked up at the woman who'd saved her life and said simply, "Thank you." But the territory's power structure had already shifted by then, because what happened on that Wednesday morning couldn't be undone by a single woman's recovery. The 5 ranches that had stood with Silas had formed an alliance that wouldn't dissolve when the crisis passed, because alliances built on shared need last longer than alliances built on shared anger. The Garretts still traded, still ran the post, still moved goods through the territory, but they no longer dictated terms, and Deacon Garrett understood arithmetic better than anyone. And Yuki didn't just work at the Double C, she worked for the territory, riding to whichever ranch needed her, treating the sick and the injured with her grandmother's tools and her own steady hands, and coming home to Silas's house every single time. The first snow of the season came to the Double C 3 weeks after the fever broke, drifting down in fat flakes that stuck to the fence wire and the barn roof and the hood of the carriage Silas had bought from the trading post the day everything changed. Yuki sat at the kitchen table, grinding herbs with a stone mortar, the medicine box open beside her, a fire in the stove, and the smell of ginger and something bitter filling the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas came in from the cold stamping snow off his boots, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work, the quiet efficiency of her hands, the stillness between movements, the way the firelight caught the brass hinges of the medicine box and turned them gold. He crossed to the table and set a cup of coffee beside her, and she paused, the pestle motionless in her hands, and looked at the cup and then at him. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implied a debt, and they were past debts, but recognition, the same thing that had passed between them at the trading post when she'd watched him decide to risk everything, clearer now, sharper, like a lens that had been slowly focusing and finally found its mark. The lie that had started as survival had become something neither of them named out loud, and it wasn't love, not yet, because neither of them was ready for that word, but something quieter and more durable, a partnership built on respect and action, and the kind of trust that doesn't need announcing because it shows up every day in the small things. In coffee left on the table and herbs ground before dawn, and the way she looked at him when he asked if she needed anything from town. Tom Avery's voice came from outside, calling Silas about the fence line on the north ridge, and Silas turned to go, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame. "You need anything from town? More ginger root?" Yuki said. He nodded, and the door closed behind him, and the fire crackled in the stove, and the pestle turned in the mortar, and outside the snow fell on a territory that was learning a new word for power. It wasn't a gun, and it wasn't a badge, and it wasn't a lie spoken to save a stranger's life, though it had started with one. It was the quiet, irreplaceable skill of a woman who'd been chained in a grain bin and walked out of it on her own terms, and the man who'd given her the chance, not by saving her, but by refusing to look away. The medicine box sits on the kitchen table, needles catching firelight, the mortar still turning. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world.